When my children complained that my Christmas gifts looked like they came from the dollar store, I smiled and nodded. What they didn't know was that by next Christmas, their entire inheritance would actually be in the dollar store. If this story resonates with you, let me know in the comments which state you're listening from. I'm curious to know where you're tuning in from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lourdes Champ, and at 68 years old, I had spent the better part of 5 decades building something I thought would matter. Not a fortune. I was never wealthy by any stretch, but a life of careful choices, modest savings, and the kind of steady accumulation that comes from working 2 jobs and never buying anything you couldn't afford twice. I lived in a small ranch house in Bakersfield, California, the kind of place where the summer heat bakes the lawns brown, and the winter fog rolls in thick enough to lose yourself in. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside: beige stucco, a red tile roof that needed repair, and a driveway cracked down the middle like a fault line. But it was mine, paid off after 32 years of mortgage payments that I never missed, not once. Inside, everything had its place. The living room furniture was the same set I'd bought in 1987, a brown corduroy couch and matching chair that had weathered 3 grandchildren, 2 dogs, and countless family gatherings. The coffee table was scarred with ring stains from glasses and cups, each mark a memory of someone who had sat there, feet up, comfortable enough to forget to use a coaster. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades: school pictures, wedding photos, vacation snapshots from trips to places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, back when gas was cheap enough to drive cross-country. I had worked as a bookkeeper for a small construction company for 28 years, the kind of job that required showing up every day whether you felt like it or not. The pay was steady but never generous. Every dollar had to be stretched, every purchase carefully considered. I learned to shop sales, to buy in bulk when it made sense, to repair instead of replace. My clothes came from discount stores, my groceries from whatever market had the best prices that week. I clipped coupons not because I was cheap, but because I was building something larger than the moment I was living in. Milolo. After work, I cleaned office buildings downtown. 3 nights a week, I'd drive through the empty streets of Bakersfield, with my vacuum cleaner and cleaning supplies in the back seat, letting myself into silent offices where other people spent their days making money I'd never see. I'd empty trash cans, wipe down desks, vacuum carpets worn thin by expensive shoes. The work was invisible. Nobody ever saw me do it, and if I did it well, nobody ever noticed it had been done at all. But it paid for my children's school clothes, for piano lessons my daughter Sarah never appreciated, for the baseball equipment my son Michael needed every spring. The money accumulated slowly, deliberately. I had a savings account at the local credit union, the kind of place where the tellers knew your name and asked about your family. Every month, without fail, I deposited whatever was left after the bills were paid. Some months it was $50, some months it was $200. It didn't matter how much. What mattered was the habit, the discipline, the quiet promise I made to myself and to my children that their future would be more secure than their present. I invested carefully, conservatively. No get-rich-quick schemes, no stock tips from well-meaning friends. I bought index funds and held them, even when the market dropped and everyone around me was panicking. I learned about compound interest the hard way, by watching my small contributions grow grain by grain, year after year. The statements came quarterly, showing numbers that climbed steadily upward like a mountain built 1 stone at a time. By the time I retired, I had managed to accumulate just over $400,000. Not enough to live lavishly, but enough to live comfortably. Enough to leave something behind. I had always imagined that money would go to my children: Sarah, who was 42 and worked as a nurse in Sacramento, and Michael, who was 39 and sold insurance in Phoenix. They had their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. I wanted to be the safety net their father and I never had. My husband Robert had died 8 years earlier, a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. One moment he was commenting on the weather forecast, the next moment he was gone, slumped forward with his coffee mug still warm in his hand. The funeral was small but well attended. Robert had been the kind of man who helped neighbors fix their cars and never mentioned it afterward. After he died, I found a shoebox in his closet filled with thank you notes from people whose lives he had touched in small, quiet ways. Living alone changed everything. The house felt larger and smaller at the same time. Too much space for one person, but somehow cramped with memories that had nowhere to go. I learned to cook for one, to make decisions without consulting anyone, to fall asleep to the sound of my own breathing instead of Robert's gentle snoring. I wasn't lonely, exactly, but I was aware of my solitude in a way I had never been before. The children called regularly, especially at first. Sarah would phone on Sunday afternoons to check in, her voice bright with the kind of cheerfulness that meant she was trying not to worry about me. Michael called less often, but visited more, driving up from Phoenix every few months with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenagers. The visits were pleasant but felt choreographed, like everyone was playing a part in a play about a happy family. I began to notice things during those visits that I hadn't paid attention to before. The way Sarah's eyes wandered around the house, mentally cataloging what might be worth keeping and what could be donated. The way Michael asked casual questions about my finances, couched as concern for my well-being but carrying an undertone of something else. The way Jennifer made comments about my vintage furniture and retro decorations, words that sounded complimentary but felt dismissive. I started planning my gift-giving more carefully. For birthdays and holidays, I would spend weeks thinking about what each person might want or need. I shopped at department stores, bought name brands, kept receipts in case anything needed to be returned. I wanted my gifts to be meaningful, to show how much thought I had put into choosing them. I wanted to give things that would last, that would remind the recipients of me long after I was gone. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe it was the way my grandson Tyler rolled his eyes when he opened the sweater I had spent hours choosing for him. Maybe it was the way Sarah's daughter Emma set aside the jewelry box I had given her, without even opening it properly. Maybe it was the forced smiles and perfunctory thank yous that felt more like politeness than gratitude. I began to sense that my gifts were being tolerated rather than appreciated, endured rather than enjoyed. The house in Bakersfield began to feel like a museum of my own life, filled with objects that had meaning only to me. The china cabinet held dishes that hadn't been used since Robert's funeral. The closets were full of clothes from different decades, different versions of myself. The garage contained boxes of Christmas decorations, photo albums, and mementos from trips and celebrations that seemed to belong to someone else's memories. I started to wonder what would happen to it all when I was gone. Would Sarah and Michael divide it up between them, keeping what they wanted and selling the rest? Would they fight over things that mattered to me but meant nothing to them? Would they understand the stories behind the objects? Or would everything just become stuff to be disposed of as efficiently as possible? The thought kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. This wasn't about money or material possessions, not really. It was about recognition, about the hope that a lifetime of careful choices and small sacrifices would be seen and valued by the people I loved most. I had built something modest but real, and I wanted it to matter to someone besides me. I began to pay closer attention to my children's lives, not just the surface pleasantries of our phone calls, but the deeper currents underneath. Sarah lived in a large house in an expensive suburb, drove a new car every few years, took vacations to places I had only seen in magazines. Michael's insurance business was thriving. He talked about investment properties and retirement accounts with the casual confidence of someone who had never worried about making ends meet. They had succeeded in ways that made me proud, but their success also created a distance between us that I didn't know how to bridge. The gifts I gave began to feel inadequate, not because they weren't expensive enough, but because they came from a different world than the one my children now inhabited. I shopped at stores they would never enter, bought brands they wouldn't recognize, chose items that reflected my values rather than their lifestyles. The gap between what I could afford and what they expected was growing wider each year, and I was beginning to feel like I was failing at the one thing I had always been good at: taking care of my family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Christmas 2023 was supposed to be different. I had been planning it for months, squirreling away money from my Social Security checks and the small pension from the construction company. By November, I had saved nearly $800 specifically for gifts, more than I had ever spent in a single holiday season. I wanted this Christmas to be memorable, to show my family how much they meant to me through the thoughtfulness of what I gave them. I started my shopping in early November, armed with a carefully written list and a determination to get everything right. For Sarah's husband, David, I found a leather wallet at Macy's, genuine leather, not the synthetic stuff, with his initials embossed in gold. It cost me $68, but I imagined him pulling it out in meetings, feeling the weight and quality of it, maybe thinking of me when he did. For Jennifer, Michael's wife, I chose a silk scarf from Nordstrom Rack, still designer but marked down to $45. The pattern was elegant, blues and greens that would complement her blonde hair. The grandchildren were harder. Tyler, at 16, seemed to want nothing but expensive electronics that were far beyond my budget. I settled on a nice sweater from The Gap, navy blue with a subtle pattern, the kind of thing that would look good for school or family events. It was $34, and I kept the receipt in case it didn't fit. For Emma, who was 14 and obsessed with makeup, I bought a starter kit from Sephora that the salesgirl assured me was perfect for beginners. $52 for tiny containers of things I didn't understand, but the packaging was sleek and sophisticated. Sarah was the most challenging. As a nurse, she was practical, but she also had expensive tastes that she indulged when her budget allowed. I found a beautiful journal at Barnes & Noble, leather-bound with cream-colored pages and a ribbon bookmark. I thought she might use it for work notes or personal thoughts. The price tag said $38, but it felt substantial in my hands, like something that would last. For Michael, I chose a nice bottle of whiskey from the liquor store. Not the top shelf, but a respectable, middle-tier brand that the clerk recommended. $43 seemed reasonable for something he could enjoy over time, maybe share with friends during business dinners or save for special occasions. I wrapped everything carefully, using good paper from Hallmark instead of the generic stuff from the grocery store. Each gift was perfectly creased, ribbons tied in neat bows, name tags written in my best handwriting. I arranged them under my small artificial tree, the same one I'd been using for 15 years, and stepped back to admire my work. The pile looked modest but respectable, each package representing hours of thought and careful budgeting. Christmas Eve dinner was at Sarah's house, as it had been for the past 5 years. Her home in Sacramento was everything mine wasn't: spacious, modern, decorated with things that matched and had been purchased intentionally rather than accumulated over time. The kitchen had granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that gleamed under recessed lighting. The living room featured a massive sectional sofa arranged around a 70-inch television mounted on the wall like a piece of art. I arrived at 5 o'clock with my gifts in 2 shopping bags, feeling underdressed despite having worn my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd bought for Robert's funeral and had worn to every important family event since. Sarah greeted me with a hug that felt genuine but brief, already distracted by the dinner preparations. The house smelled of ham and something sweet, probably the expensive candles she bought from boutiques I'd never heard of. The grandchildren were absorbed in their phones, barely looking up when I arrived. Tyler had grown taller since my last visit, his voice deeper, his shoulders broader. He looked more like his father every year, with the same confident posture and direct gaze. Emma was experimenting with makeup, her face painted with the kind of precision that came from watching countless YouTube tutorials. She was beautiful in that uncertain way of teenage girls, caught between childhood and whatever came next. Michael and Jennifer arrived an hour later, their teenagers in tow, Brandon, 17, and Madison, 15. The house suddenly felt crowded with conversation and movement, everyone talking at once about work and school and vacation plans. I found myself seated in a corner chair, listening to fragments of conversations I couldn't fully follow, discussions about people I'd never met, and places I'd never been. Dinner was elaborate: spiral-cut ham with a glaze that caught the light, mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, green bean casserole that looked nothing like the version I made from canned ingredients. Sarah had clearly spent days preparing, and everything was delicious. We ate off her good china, drank from crystal glasses that caught the candlelight. I complimented every dish, asked for recipes I knew I'd never make, and tried to contribute to conversations that moved too quickly for me to find my footing. After dinner, we gathered in the living room for gift exchange. The tree was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, and covered with ornaments that Sarah had collected over the years. Each one had a story. This one from their honeymoon in Europe, that one from Emma's first Christmas, another from a boutique in San Francisco where they'd gone for David's birthday. The presents beneath it formed a small mountain, wrapped in coordinated paper that suggested professional shopping services, or at least unlimited budgets. I distributed my gifts first, watching faces carefully as each person unwrapped what I had chosen for them. The reactions were polite but muted. David examined the wallet with what I interpreted as appreciation, running his fingers over the leather and checking the card slots. "Very nice, lords. Thank you." Jennifer held up the scarf, smiled, and folded it carefully back into its box. "This is lovely. Thank you so much." Tyler pulled a sweater from its tissue paper, held it up briefly, and set it aside with a nod. "Thanks, Grandma." Emma opened the makeup kit with more enthusiasm, examining each component with teenage intensity, but I could see something flicker across her face, a moment of evaluation, of comparison with the cosmetics she already owned. Sarah opened her journal last, running her hand over the leather cover and flipping through the blank pages. "This is beautiful, Mom. Really thoughtful." But there was something in her tone, a careful neutrality that made me wonder if she was being kind rather than honest. Then came the real gift exchange. The presents they gave each other. Tyler received a new iPhone, the latest model that cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Emma unwrapped a laptop for college applications, sleek and silver and impossibly thin. Brandon got a gaming system I'd never heard of, and Madison received a designer purse that she clutched to her chest like a treasure. The adults were more restrained but no less generous. Sarah gave David a smartwatch that tracked everything from his heart rate to his sleep patterns. Michael presented Jennifer with earrings that sparkled even in the lamplight. Real diamonds, I realized, not the cubic zirconia I was used to seeing. Sarah received a weekend getaway to Napa Valley from David, complete with spa treatments and wine tastings. I watched it all with growing awareness that my gifts, thoughtful as they had been, belonged to a different universe than the one my family now inhabited. The sweater I'd spent $34 on cost less than what Tyler probably spent on lunch with friends. The journal that had seemed so elegant in the bookstore looked quaint next to the electronic gadgets that defined their daily lives. But it was the conversation afterward that truly stung. As we cleaned up the wrapping paper and sorted through the gifts, I overheard Emma talking to Madison in the kitchen. "My grandma tries so hard," Emma said, her voice carrying that particular teenage combination of affection and embarrassment. "But everything she gives us looks like it came from the dollar store." Madison laughed. Not cruelly, just the easy laugh of someone who had never worried about money. "At least she tries. My grandparents just give cash now." I know, it's sweet. But this makeup is the kind they sell at drugstores. And Tyler's sweater looks like something from Walmart." I stood frozen in the hallway, my hands full of discarded ribbons and torn paper, feeling like I'd been slapped. They weren't being mean, exactly. They were just being honest in the way that young people are, stating facts without considering their impact. To them, my gifts weren't expressions of love carefully planned and budgeted for. They were obligations to be acknowledged and set aside. The ride home was quiet, the California highway dark, except for the occasional truck stop and gas station. I replayed the evening in my mind, not just Emma's words but the entire choreographed performance of family togetherness. The polite thank yous, the careful smiles, the way my gifts had been quickly moved aside to make room for the real presents, the ones with price tags that matched their expectations. I thought about the $800 I'd spent, money that had taken months to save from my fixed income. To my family, it represented mediocrity, disappointment, disguised as effort. To me, it represented sacrifice, dinners out I hadn't had, repairs I'd postponed, small pleasures I denied myself in service of their happiness. As I pulled into my driveway in Bakersfield, the motion sensor light illuminating my cracked concrete and struggling lawn, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't just about the gifts or even the money. It was about the growing recognition that I had become a peripheral figure in the lives I had spent decades building and supporting. Inside my small house, surrounded by furniture they considered outdated and decorations they found quaint, I sat in my kitchen and looked at the Christmas cards Sarah had given me, a generic scene of snow and pine trees with Love, Sarah, David, Tyler, and Emma printed inside. No personal message, no acknowledgement of the years I'd spent being present for every milestone, every crisis, every celebration. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had planned our modest life together, where I'd paid bills and balanced checkbooks and dreamed small dreams that now seemed even smaller. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I simply stopped trying. What if I stopped buying gifts that disappointed them? What if I stopped pretending that my presence mattered in their increasingly expensive lives? What if I acknowledged that love, like everything else, had become subject to market forces I couldn't compete with? The idea wasn't born of anger but of clarity. My children had moved beyond the world I could afford to participate in, and my attempts to bridge that gap were only highlighting the distance between us. They loved me, I believed that, but they loved me the way you love an old photograph, with fondness and nostalgia but no real relevance to your current life. I finished my tea and went to bed, but sleep was elusive. Instead, I lay in the dark and began to consider possibilities I had never allowed myself to contemplate before. What if the inheritance I'd spent decades building didn't have to follow the traditional path? What if there were other ways to distribute a lifetime of savings, other people who might value what I had accumulated through years of careful choices and quiet sacrifice? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. But as the night wore on and the house settled around me, it began to feel less like betrayal and more like justice. The weeks following Christmas passed in a strange suspension, as if I were watching my own life from a distance. January in Bakersfield was cold and gray, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside and avoid unnecessary movement. I found myself doing exactly that, venturing out only for essentials, groceries, doctor appointments, the occasional trip to the bank. My daily routines continued unchanged on the surface. I still woke at 7, made coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for years, and checked the thermostat before settling into my morning chair by the front window. But something fundamental had shifted in how I experienced these familiar rituals. They no longer felt like the comfortable structure of retirement. They felt like the mechanical movements of someone waiting for something to happen. The thank you calls came within a week of Christmas. Perfectly timed and appropriately grateful, Sarah called first, her voice bright with what I now recognized as practiced enthusiasm. "Mom, that journal is just gorgeous. I've already started using it for my work notes. David loves his wallet too. He's been showing it off to everyone at the office." Michael's call came 2 days later, his tone warm but rushed. "Lords, that whiskey is top-notch. Jennifer and I are saving it for a special occasion. And the kids really appreciated their gifts too. You know how teenagers are with expressing gratitude." I responded to both calls with the appropriate maternal pleasure, asking about their New Year's plans and their work schedules. But underneath the familiar banter, I found myself listening differently, hearing not just what they said, but what they didn't say. There was no mention of the makeup kit sitting unused in Emma's room, no acknowledgement that Tyler had probably never worn the sweater, no recognition that my $800 had bought them nothing they actually wanted or needed. The realization didn't come as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of small observations. I began to notice how my children spoke about money when they thought I wasn't really listening. During our phone calls, they would mention dinners that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week, casual purchases that exceeded my monthly entertainment budget, weekend trips that would have consumed my entire discretionary spending for several months. It wasn't that they were bragging or trying to make me feel excluded. They were simply living in an economic reality so different from mine that they had forgotten how the other half existed. When Sarah mentioned getting her hair done for $120, she wasn't trying to hurt me. She had genuinely forgotten that I cut my own hair over the bathroom sink to save $30 every 6 weeks. I started paying attention to their social media posts in a way I never had before. Sarah's Instagram was filled with photos from expensive restaurants, artfully arranged plates of food that probably cost more than I typically spent on dinner for a week. Michael's Facebook showed family trips to ski resorts and beach resorts, hotels with infinity pools, and kids holding drinks that came with little umbrellas. The pictures weren't meant to exclude me. I was tagged in family photos when they remembered, and they always looked genuinely happy. But they revealed lives lived at a financial altitude I could never reach. Experiences that required a level of disposable income that was completely foreign to my fixed-budget existence. I began to understand that the distance between us wasn't just generational or geographical, it was economic, and it was growing wider every year. Their salaries had lifted them into a social class that made my careful budgeting and coupon clipping seem not just outdated but almost quaint, like a hobby from a bygone era rather than a financial necessity. The understanding brought with it a strange kind of relief. For years, I had been trying to participate in a game whose rules I didn't understand, spending money I couldn't afford to buy into a lifestyle that existed beyond my reach. The failure hadn't been mine. It had been an impossible task from the beginning. One particularly gray afternoon in late January, I found myself standing in my bedroom closet, looking at the small fireproof safe where I kept my important documents. Inside were the financial statements I reviewed every quarter, the papers that documented the $400,000 I had managed to accumulate over decades of careful saving and conservative investing. The number had always represented security to me, a buffer against the uncertainties of old age, and a legacy to leave my children. But as I held the latest statement in my hands, I began to see it differently. To Sarah and Michael, who regularly discussed their retirement accounts and investment portfolios with casual confidence, $400,000 wasn't life-changing money. It was nice, certainly, but it wouldn't fund the kind of lifestyle they had grown accustomed to for more than a few years. I thought about what would happen when that money eventually passed to them. It would probably pay for a nice vacation, maybe help with a down payment on a bigger house, or fund the grandchildren's college expenses. It would be appreciated and used responsibly, but it wouldn't transform their lives the way it might transform someone else's. That thought led me down a path I had never explored before. What if there were people for whom $400,000 would represent genuine transformation? What if there were families for whom that money could mean the difference between struggling and thriving, between desperation and hope? I started researching online, something I had never done with any real purpose before. The computer Robert had bought me for my 65th birthday had mostly been used for email and the occasional online shopping. But now I found myself diving into websites for local charities, reading about programs that helped families escape poverty, organizations that provided job training and housing assistance, and emergency relief. The stories I read were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Single mothers working multiple jobs to keep their children fed and housed, families who had lost everything to medical bills or job loss, people who were one emergency away from homelessness, veterans struggling with invisible wounds, elderly people choosing between medications and groceries. I read about scholarship programs that sent deserving students to college, about organizations that helped former inmates rebuild their lives, about shelters that provided not just temporary housing but the services people needed to get back on their feet permanently. I learned about micro-lending programs that helped people start small businesses, about financial literacy programs that taught basic money management to people who had never learned it. Each story carried with it the implicit understanding that relatively small amounts of money could have enormous impacts when directed toward people who truly needed it. A few $1,000s could keep a family housed during a medical crisis. $10,000 could fund a semester of college for a first-generation student. $25,000 could help someone start a business that would support their family for years. The more I read, the more I began to understand that my $400,000 represented a kind of power I had never recognized. In the right hands, distributed thoughtfully, it could change dozens of lives in ways that my children's inheritances never would. It could be the difference between someone's dreams dying and taking flight. I started visiting some of these organizations in person, driving to community centers and nonprofit offices scattered throughout the Central Valley. I told myself I was just gathering information, just satisfying curiosity about how these programs actually worked. But with each visit, I found myself more convinced that there were better uses for my life savings than padding my children's already comfortable existences. The people I met at these organizations weren't broken or defeated, despite the challenges they faced. They were resilient, resourceful, determined to build better lives for themselves and their families. They reminded me of myself at their age, willing to work hard, to sacrifice, to do whatever was necessary to move forward. The difference was that they lacked the opportunities and safety nets that had allowed me to accumulate wealth slowly and steadily over time. A conversation with Maria Santos at the Central Valley Community Foundation particularly stayed with me. Maria ran a program that provided small business loans to women trying to escape domestic violence. She told me about clients who had fled abusive relationships with nothing but their children and their determination to start over. $5,000 can completely change the trajectory of someone's life, Maria explained as we sat in her modest office, surrounded by success stories pinned to bulletin boards. It can fund the training they need to get a good job, or help them start a cleaning business or a food truck. It's not charity, it's investment in people who just need a chance. I thought about Emma's makeup collection, probably worth close to $5,000, sitting largely unused in her bedroom. I thought about Tyler's electronics, upgraded regularly because last year's phone or gaming system was no longer cutting edge. I thought about the casual dinners and weekend trips that consumed thousands of dollars without creating lasting value or meaningful change. The contrast was stark and undeniable. My family spent money on lifestyle maintenance, on keeping up with friends and colleagues, on satisfying wants they had learned to categorize as needs. These organizations used money to transform lives, to create opportunities where none had existed, to build foundations for futures that might otherwise remain impossible dreams. As February arrived and the days began to grow incrementally longer, I found myself thinking less about what my children deserved and more about what they actually needed. They had built successful careers, accumulated their own wealth, created comfortable lives for their families. They were financially secure in ways I had never been at their age. My inheritance would be a nice bonus, but it wouldn't change their fundamental circumstances. The idea that had been forming in my mind since Christmas began to solidify into something more concrete. What if I could use my money to create the kind of meaningful impact that my gifts had failed to achieve? What if I could find a way to honor the values that had shaped my life? Hard work, sacrifice, helping others, while acknowledging the reality of who my children had become. I wasn't angry with them anymore. I was simply awake to the truth that love and financial legacy didn't have to follow the same path. I could love my children completely while recognizing that my money might serve a higher purpose elsewhere. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that jumping might be the only way to fly. The Dollar Tree on Ming Avenue became an unlikely catalyst for what would become the most important decision of my life. I had driven past it countless times over the years, never giving it much thought beyond the occasional mental note that it existed. But on a Tuesday morning in early March, when I needed to pick up some basic cleaning supplies and my budget was tighter than usual after an unexpected car repair, I decided to stop in. The store was busier than I had expected, filled with people who moved through the aisles with the focused efficiency of those who knew exactly what they were looking for. Young mothers with toddlers in tow, elderly people comparing prices on items they clearly needed rather than wanted, workers on lunch breaks grabbing snacks and drinks. These weren't people slumming for novelty items or hunting for quirky decorations. These were people for whom every dollar genuinely mattered. I found what I needed quickly: dish soap, paper towels, laundry detergent, all priced at exactly $1 each. As I walked through the store, I began to notice things I hadn't expected. The reading glasses display offered the same strength prescriptions I paid $15 for at the pharmacy. The storage containers were identical to ones I had seen at Target for 3 times the price. The greeting cards, while not as elaborate as those at Hallmark, were perfectly adequate for their purpose. At the checkout counter, I watched the woman ahead of me carefully count out exact change for her purchases. She was probably in her 30s, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare, and she was buying items that painted a picture of careful household management: generic shampoo, school supplies, snacks that would stretch into several lunches. Her total came to $14, and she handed over a 10 and 4 ones with the precise movements of someone who knew exactly how much money she had. As I paid for my own items, the cashier, a teenager with kind eyes and practiced patience, smiled and asked if I had found everything I needed. Something about the interaction felt different from shopping at the stores I usually frequented. There was no pretense here, no artificial courtesy designed to make customers feel special or important. There was simply honest service, provided by people who understood that their customers were there out of necessity rather than choice. Driving home, I found myself thinking about Emma's casual dismissal of my gifts as dollar store quality. At the time, her comment had stung because it diminished the thought and money I had put into choosing presents for my family. But now I began to consider it from a different angle. What exactly was wrong with dollar store quality if it served its purpose? Why had dollar store become synonymous with inadequate or shameful? That afternoon, I did something I had never done before. I researched the Dollar Tree Corporation, reading about its business model and its customer base. What I learned challenged assumptions I hadn't even realized I held. The company served millions of customers who depended on its low prices to stretch their budgets. It provided jobs in communities where employment opportunities were often limited. It offered dignity to people who might otherwise struggle to afford basic necessities. I began to see the dollar store not as a symbol of cheapness or inadequacy, but as a lifeline for people navigating financial constraints I understood better than my children ever would. These were my people, I realized. People who clipped coupons and compared prices and made careful decisions about every purchase. People who had learned to find value in simplicity and functionality, rather than brand names and status symbols. The idea that would eventually reshape my entire estate plan began as a simple thought experiment. What if I could create a program that utilized the dollar store infrastructure to help people in need? What if I could find a way to make my inheritance work for people who would genuinely benefit from assistance with basic necessities? I started visiting different dollar stores throughout the Central Valley, not as a customer but as an observer. I watched families make careful selections, saw parents teaching children about budgeting and priority setting, witnessed the small celebrations that came with finding exactly what was needed at a price that wouldn't strain an already tight budget. At a store in Fresno, I overheard a conversation between two elderly women debating whether to buy a birthday card for a grandchild. $2 seems like a lot for a card, one said to the other. But it's her 16th birthday, it feels wrong to skip it. They settled on a simple card and a small gift bag, their total coming to $3. I thought about the cards my family purchased for each other, elaborate affairs that cost $8 or $10 and were thrown away within a week. At another store in Modesto, I watched a single mother with 3 young children navigate their shopping trip with military precision. She had a list written on the back of an envelope, and she directed her children to specific aisles while she handled the essentials. When her youngest asked for a toy, she gently explained that toys weren't on the list today, but maybe next time if they were good at the grocery store. The child accepted this without argument, clearly accustomed to the family's financial realities. These observations began to crystallize into something more concrete. I started researching charitable programs that provided gift cards or vouchers to families in need, studying how these programs were administered and what impact they had on recipients. I learned about organizations that provided holiday assistance, back-to-school shopping help, and emergency relief for families facing sudden crises. The more I learned, the more excited I became about the possibilities. Traditional charity often involved complicated applications, waiting periods, and requirements that could be difficult for people to navigate. But gift cards to dollar stores offered something different: immediate access to necessities without bureaucratic barriers or means testing. A family facing eviction could buy cleaning supplies to prepare for a new apartment. A parent could purchase school supplies without worrying about the cost. Someone starting over after a personal crisis could stock up on basics without depleting their limited resources. I began sketching out ideas for how this might work. What if I could establish a fund that provided dollar store gift cards to people recommended by social service agencies, churches, and community organizations? What if caseworkers could have a stack of $50 cards to distribute to clients who needed help with basics? What if teachers could provide supplies to students whose families couldn't afford them? Ba'illah, chatahan fa kaishar zasuro ikars. My $400,000 could purchase $400,000 worth of gift cards. Distributed in denominations of $25 or $50, that would represent 8 to 16,000 individual acts of assistance. Each card would go directly to someone who needed help with basic necessities, without administrative overhead or complicated qualification processes. I contacted several local organizations to test the feasibility of my idea. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Social workers told me about clients who regularly skipped meals to afford cleaning supplies or school materials. Teachers described students who came to school without basic supplies because their families had to choose between notebooks and groceries. Church volunteers shared stories of families who needed help with everyday items but were too proud to ask for traditional charity. This would be revolutionary, explained Janet Rodriguez, a social worker with Kern County. We have families who need help with basics, but our programs are designed for big emergencies: rent assistance, utility payments, food boxes. There's no funding for the small stuff that adds up to real hardship. A gift card program would fill that gap perfectly. Pastor Williams at the Community Baptist Church was equally excited. We see families who are working but still struggling. They don't qualify for most assistance programs because they're employed, but they're living paycheck to paycheck. Being able to help them with household supplies or school needs would mean everything. As these conversations progressed, I began to understand that my idea addressed a real need in the community. There were people everywhere who fell into the gap between poverty programs and financial stability. Families who worked hard but still struggled to afford basics. Individuals who needed help but didn't qualify for traditional assistance. The dollar store model made perfect sense for this population. The stores were conveniently located, the selection covered most basic needs, and the fixed pricing eliminated any concern about overspending or making inappropriate choices. Recipients could shop with dignity, selecting items based on their actual needs rather than accepting whatever happened to be available through traditional charity programs. I started doing more detailed research into the mechanics of gift card programs. I learned about bulk purchasing discounts, about how cards could be customized with specific restrictions or expiration dates, about tracking systems that could help organizations monitor their distribution. I discovered that many national retailers offered special programs for nonprofit organizations, providing both discounts and administrative support. The legal aspects were more complex but not insurmountable. I would need to establish a foundation or partner with an existing nonprofit organization. There would be tax implications to consider, administrative structures to create, oversight mechanisms to establish. But none of these challenges seemed impossible, and several attorneys I contacted expressed enthusiasm for the project's unique approach to charitable giving. By the end of March, what had started as a vague idea had developed into a concrete plan. I would establish the Dollar Store Angel Fund, partnering with local organizations to distribute gift cards to individuals and families recommended by trusted community partners. The program would prioritize dignity and immediate assistance over bureaucratic processes and long-term oversight. Niniband. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had dismissed my gifts as dollar store quality, seeing that designation as an insult. But I was beginning to understand that for many people, access to dollar store merchandise represented not inadequacy, but opportunity. The chance to provide for their families without compromising their dignity or depleting their resources. Emma's thoughtless comment had revealed more than just her ingratitude. It had exposed the chasm between the world my family now inhabited and the world where most people actually lived. She saw dollar stores as symbols of cheapness and failure. I was beginning to see them as symbols of resourcefulness and resilience. Places where people made their limited resources go as far as possible while maintaining their pride and independence. The decision was crystallizing, but I wasn't quite ready to make it final. There was still the question of my family, of how to handle the conversation about redirecting their inheritance. That challenge would require careful thought and considerable courage. But for now, I was content to develop the framework for what might become my most meaningful legacy, a gift that would honor the values that had shaped my life while creating real impact for people who truly needed help. Before I committed my entire inheritance to an untested idea, I decided to conduct a small-scale experiment, In early April, I withdrew $5,000 from my savings account, money that represented 2 months of my living expenses, but a manageable loss if my plan proved flawed. I purchased $250 gift cards from Dollar Tree, each one loaded with credit that could be used at any of their locations nationwide. The cards themselves were simple plastic rectangles, unremarkable except for the potential they represented. As I held the stack in my hands, I calculated the impact. Enough to help 50 families with basic necessities, or to provide 25 families with a more substantial shopping trip. Each card represented possibilities: school supplies for children, cleaning products for someone starting fresh, personal care items for people whose budgets rarely allowed for such luxuries. I reached out to the organizations I had been researching, explaining that I wanted to pilot a small assistance program. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, I had commitments from 6 different agencies who wanted to participate: the Kern County Social Services Department, 3 local churches, a domestic violence shelter, and a community center that served primarily Spanish-speaking immigrants. Each organization agreed to track the distribution of cards and follow up with recipients when possible, not for oversight purposes, but to understand the program's impact. I wasn't interested in controlling how people spent the money. The whole point was to provide assistance without judgment or restrictions beyond those inherent in the store's merchandise selection. The first distribution took place at Sacred Heart Community Center, a modest building tucked between a laundromat and an auto repair shop on the east side of Bakersfield. I arrived early, nervous about whether my idea would translate into meaningful help or simply create confusion and administrative burden for the volunteers. Rosa Martinez, the center's coordinator, introduced me to the families who had been selected for assistance. These weren't people seeking charity in the traditional sense. They were working families who used the center's services for childcare, English classes, and community connections. Many of them held multiple jobs but still struggled to make ends meet in California's expensive economy. The first recipient was Carmen Jimenez, a woman in her 30s who worked nights cleaning offices while attending community college during the day. She had 2 young children and a determination that reminded me of my younger self. When Rosa handed her the $50 gift card, Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "This means I can buy my daughter the notebooks she needs for school," Carmen explained in careful English. "And maybe some soap that smells nice. We always buy the cheapest kind. But she asks sometimes why ours doesn't smell like flowers like her friends." The specificity of her gratitude struck me immediately. This wasn't abstract appreciation for financial assistance. It was recognition of concrete improvements to daily life. Carmen wasn't thinking about major purchases or life-changing investments. She was thinking about school supplies and scented soap, small dignities that my family took for granted, but that represented luxury to someone stretching every dollar. Marcus Thompson, a veteran in his 50s, received the next card. He lived in a transitional housing program and worked part-time at a warehouse while dealing with chronic pain from an injury sustained during his military service. "I can get some real shampoo," he said quietly, "and maybe some of those vitamins they sell. I haven't been able to afford vitamins in months." Again, the focus was on basics: personal care items and health supplements that fell outside the scope of food assistance programs, but were essential for maintaining dignity and well-being. Marcus wasn't planning to buy anything frivolous or inappropriate. He was thinking about fundamental needs that his limited income couldn't consistently cover. As I watched more families receive cards, I began to understand the psychological impact of the program beyond its financial value. These weren't food stamps or welfare checks that came with implicit judgment and bureaucratic oversight. These were gift cards that allowed recipients to shop like any other customer, to make choices based on their personal preferences and immediate needs. Maria Santos, the domestic violence program coordinator I had met earlier, distributed cards to 3 women who were rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. "They can buy cleaning supplies for their new apartments," she explained, "or personal care items they had to leave behind. Sometimes it's the small things that help people feel human again after trauma." One of the women, Jennifer Hayes, clutched her card like it was precious metal. "I can buy my son some crayons," she whispered. "He loves to draw, but I had to leave everything behind when we moved to the shelter. This means he can have art supplies again." The pattern that emerged from these interactions was both heartening and sobering. Every recipient focused on necessities: school supplies, personal care items, cleaning products, basic household goods. No one mentioned entertainment or luxury items. No one seemed to view the cards as opportunities for frivolous spending. These were people who understood the value of $1 because they had learned to stretch every penny. Over the following weeks, I began receiving feedback from the participating organizations. The reports were uniformly positive, but it was the specific details that convinced me I was on the right track. Teachers reported that students showed up to class with proper supplies for the first time in months. Social workers noted improved hygiene and self-esteem among clients who could afford personal care products. Shelter volunteers observed families taking pride in setting up their new homes with cleaning supplies and basic necessities they had purchased themselves rather than received as charity donations. Father Miguel at St. Catherine's Catholic Church called to tell me about the Rodriguez family, who had used their card to buy supplies for the small catering business they were trying to start from their apartment. They bought storage containers and serving utensils, he explained. Nothing fancy, but everything they needed to package meals properly. That $50 card might have been the difference between their business succeeding and failing. The economic multiplier effect hadn't occurred to me initially, but it became increasingly apparent. When people could afford basic necessities through the gift card program, their limited cash resources were freed up for other essential expenses like rent, utilities, or transportation. The cards didn't just provide access to merchandise, they provided breathing room in household budgets that were already stretched beyond their limits. Janet Rodriguez, from Kern County Social Services, shared a story that particularly moved me. A single father named David Chen had used his card to buy art supplies for his autistic daughter, who found comfort in drawing but whose special needs had consumed the family's discretionary income for months. The father called me crying, Janet reported. He said it was the first time in a year that he had been able to buy his daughter something that made her happy, rather than something she medically needed. The normalcy of that shopping trip meant everything to their family. These stories began to reshape my understanding of what constituted meaningful assistance. Traditional charity often focused on crisis intervention, helping people avoid eviction, providing emergency food, covering medical expenses. But there was a vast middle ground of ongoing struggles that these programs didn't address. People needed help with the small, daily expenses that accumulated into significant hardship over time. The gift card program operated in this overlooked space. It helped working families afford the extras that made life livable rather than simply survivable. It allowed people to maintain dignity while receiving assistance, shopping alongside other customers rather than standing in charity lines. It provided immediate help without applications, waiting periods, or means testing. After 2 months of tracking the pilot program, I had distributed all 200 cards and received feedback on most of them. The impact was measurable not just in dollars spent, but in improved morale, reduced stress, and enhanced family stability among recipients. Teachers, social workers, and community volunteers all reported positive changes in the people they served. But perhaps the most convincing evidence came from an unexpected source. Emma, my granddaughter whose comment had sparked this entire journey, called me in late May with an unusual request. She was working on a community service project for school and wanted to volunteer at a local organization. When I suggested she contact Rosa Martinez at Sacred Heart Community Center, I didn't mention my involvement in the gift card program. A week later, Emma called again, her voice full of excitement about her volunteer experience. Grandma, they have this amazing program where they give gift cards to families who need help with basic stuff. It's so much better than regular charity, because people can choose what they actually need. I helped this mom buy school supplies for her kids, and she was so happy. She said it was the first time in months she didn't have to choose between notebooks and groceries. The irony was perfect and painful. Emma was praising the very program her dismissive comment had inspired, without knowing her grandmother had created it. Her enthusiasm for the gift card concept revealed that she understood the value of practical assistance when she saw it in action, even though she had mocked similar generosity when it came from her own family. That conversation convinced me that my larger plan was sound. If a teenager who had grown up surrounded by privilege could recognize the importance of helping families afford basic necessities, then the program addressed a genuine need that transcended political and social boundaries. The gift card model worked because it respected recipients' dignity while providing meaningful assistance with everyday challenges. As summer approached, I began preparing for the next phase of my plan. The pilot program had proven that my idea could work on a small scale. Now I needed to determine whether I had the courage to implement it on a scale that would consume my entire inheritance. The feedback from the past 2 months suggested that my $400,000 could help 8,000 families, touching thousands of lives in ways that my children's inheritance never could. The test run had succeeded beyond my expectations, but it had also raised the stakes. I was no longer experimenting with a novel idea. I was contemplating a decision that would fundamentally alter my family's financial future and create ripple effects I couldn't fully predict. The question was no longer whether the program would work, but whether I was prepared to choose community impact over family tradition. The conversation I had been dreading came sooner than expected, triggered by what should have been a routine financial review. In June, my investment advisor, Patricia Wells, called to schedule our quarterly meeting. During our discussion about portfolio performance and market conditions, she mentioned that I had made some unusual withdrawals recently. The $5,000 for my pilot program had apparently raised flags in their monitoring system. I'm required to check on any significant changes in spending patterns, Patricia explained during our meeting at her downtown office. $5,000 isn't huge, but it's outside your normal withdrawal pattern. Just want to make sure everything's okay. No financial scams or unusual pressures. I assured her that the money had been used for charitable purposes, which seemed to satisfy her professional concerns. But then she shifted into a more personal tone, one that suggested she was speaking as someone who had managed my modest wealth for over a decade. Lords, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you given any thought to updating your estate planning documents? It's been several years since your last review, and with markets performing well, your portfolio has grown significantly. Your children might benefit from some advanced planning, especially regarding tax implications. The question forced me to confront the reality that I couldn't indefinitely postpone discussing my intentions with Sarah and Michael. Patricia's inquiry was reasonable and well-intentioned, but it highlighted that other people, financial advisors, lawyers, even bank personnel, expected my money to follow traditional inheritance patterns. Any significant deviation from those expectations would eventually require explanations and legal documentation. That evening, I called Sarah and Michael separately, asking them to visit the following weekend for what I described as some family business we need to discuss. I tried to keep my tone neutral, but both of them immediately assumed something was wrong with my health. Sarah offered to drive down immediately, and Michael wanted to know if I needed him to contact any doctors or specialists. Their concern was genuine and touching, but it also revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged. They loved me, but they had learned to express that love primarily through worry and protection, rather than presence and connection. They were prepared to mobilize resources to help me face a medical crisis, but they had long ago stopped thinking of me as someone whose opinions and decisions might surprise them. The weekend gathering felt different from our usual family visits. Both of my children arrived with the focused attention of people expecting to discuss serious health issues or care arrangements. Michael brought Jennifer and Sarah came with David, leaving the teenagers at home, a decision that suggested they anticipated adult conversations about difficult topics. We gathered in my living room on Saturday afternoon, the same space where we had exchanged Christmas gifts 6 months earlier. The furniture hadn't changed, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and underlying anxiety. I had prepared coffee and store-bought cookies, my usual hospitality routine, but no one seemed particularly interested in refreshments. "Mom, you're scaring us a little," Sarah began after we had settled into our chairs. "It's not like you to call family meetings. Are you feeling okay? Do you need help with anything?" I took a deep breath and began with what I thought would be the easier part of the conversation. "I'm fine, health-wise. But I have been doing some thinking about my finances. About what will happen to my savings when I'm gone." The relief on their faces was immediate and visible. Michael leaned back in his chair, and Jennifer smiled for the first time since arriving. David reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. They had been bracing for news about declining health or cognitive issues, and my mention of estate planning probably seemed like responsible forward thinking rather than cause for concern. "That's smart, Mom," Michael said. "We've been wondering when you might want to talk about that stuff." Our financial advisor says it's never too early to get everything organized. Exactly, Sarah added. We don't like thinking about it, but we want to make sure your wishes are clear and everything is set up to avoid complications later. Their responses confirmed what I had suspected. They assumed we were gathering to discuss the mechanics of their inheritance, not its fundamental structure. They expected to talk about tax strategies and document updates, not about my decision to redirect their entire financial legacy toward people they had never met. I realized there was no gentle way to introduce what I had decided, no diplomatic phrasing that would soften the impact of what I was about to tell them. So I chose directness over diplomacy. I've decided to leave my money to charity instead of to you and your families. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just quiet, completely silent, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. Michael's coffee cup remained halfway to his lips, frozen in motion. Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that might have been anger. David and Jennifer exchanged glances that suggested they wondered if they should leave the room. I'm sorry, what? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I've established a charitable fund that provides gift cards to families in need. Instead of leaving my $400,000 to you and Michael, I'm donating it to help people afford basic necessities. Michael set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever reality he thought he was inhabiting. Mom, is this some kind of joke or a test? It's not a joke. I've spent the last few months researching charitable programs and testing different approaches. I've found a way to use my money that will help hundreds of families, instead of simply adding to your already comfortable bank accounts. The explosion, when it came, was everything I had expected and worse. Are you out of your mind? Sarah's voice rose to nearly a shout. You're going to give our inheritance to strangers? Money that Dad worked for, that you saved for decades? Michael was on his feet, pacing between the couch and the window. This is insane. Mom, you can't just give away our futures because you're feeling charitable. Your futures? I asked quietly. Michael, you make 6 figures selling insurance. Sarah, you and David own a 4-bedroom house and take vacations to Europe. What exactly about your futures requires my $400,000? That's not the point, David interjected, speaking for the first time since my announcement. It's not about need. It's about family. That money represents your legacy, your life's work. It should stay in the family. Jennifer, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. Lords, this seems very sudden. Have you talked to a counselor or your doctor about this decision? Sometimes grief or depression can affect judgment. Her suggestion that I might be mentally compromised pushed Sarah over the edge. She's not depressed, she's angry. This is about Christmas, isn't it? About the gifts and Emma's comment? The accusation stung, because it contained enough truth to feel like betrayal. It's not about anger, Sarah. It's about clarity. Watching how your family responded to my gifts made me realize that you don't need my money the way other people do. So you're punishing us for being successful? Michael's voice carried a bitterness I had never heard from him before. We're being too comfortable, so you're cutting us out of your will? I'm not punishing anyone. I'm choosing to use my resources where they can make the biggest difference. Your children already have college funds and trust accounts. You own homes and businesses and retirement savings. My money won't change your lives. It will just make them slightly more comfortable. Slightly more comfortable? Sarah stood up, her face flushed with anger and what might have been tears. Mom, that money could help us pay for the kids' college, or let us retire earlier, or give us security if something goes wrong. You don't get to decide that we don't deserve it. And you don't get to decide that you do, I replied, my own voice rising for the first time. I worked 2 jobs for decades to save that money. I never took vacations, never bought new furniture, never spent money on myself. I did it all for you, and how do you show appreciation? By complaining that my gifts look like they came from the dollar store. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt dangerous rather than shocked. Everyone was staring at Emma's casual comment from Christmas, the careless words that had set this entire chain of events in motion. "Oh my God," Sarah said slowly. "This is about Emma. You're destroying our family over something a teenager said." "I'm not destroying anything. I'm making a choice about my own money based on what I've learned about my own family." Emma's comment wasn't cruel. It was honest. "You've all moved beyond the world where my gifts or my money matter in any meaningful way." Michael sat back down heavily, his anger seemingly replaced by exhaustion. "Mom, we love you. We've always loved you. We don't care where you shop or how much you spend on gifts. But you do care," I said gently. "You care enough to mock it, to see it as inadequate, to treat it as something to be tolerated rather than appreciated." The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through anger, pleading, accusations, and attempts at negotiation. Sarah suggested I could give half to charity and half to them. Michael proposed that I establish college funds for the grandchildren while donating the rest. David wondered if I might be influenced by people taking advantage of my generosity. But I had made my decision months earlier, during those long nights when I realized that my family loved me but no longer needed me in any practical sense. The pilot program had proven that my money could create real impact for people facing genuine struggles. No amount of family pressure would change that fundamental calculation. As the afternoon wore on and the initial shock faded, a different kind of sadness settled over the room. This wasn't just about money. It was about the recognition that relationships could shift in ways that couldn't be undone with apologies or promises to do better in the future. When they finally left that evening, the goodbyes were strained and formal. Sarah hugged me, but her body felt rigid. Michael kissed my cheek but avoided eye contact. David and Jennifer made polite comments about needing time to process everything. I stood in my doorway and watched their cars disappear down the street, carrying my children back to their comfortable lives and their justified anger. I had known this moment would be difficult, but I hadn't anticipated how final it would feel. Not just the end of their financial expectations, but possibly the end of our relationships as we had known them. The house felt different after they left. Not empty, but somehow changed. I had chosen my principles over family harmony, community need over blood loyalty. Whether that choice would prove to be wise or catastrophic remained to be seen, but it was irreversibly made. The weeks following the confrontation passed in a silence more complete than anything I had experienced since Robert's death. My children didn't call. They didn't text. They didn't send their usual check-in emails or forward the family photos that used to arrive sporadically in my inbox. It was as if I had been erased from their daily lives with the same efficiency they had once applied to discarding my Christmas gifts. The silence wasn't dramatic or filled with obvious hostility. It was simply nothing. No acknowledgement of my 79th birthday in July. No invitation to Tyler's graduation party. No casual updates about work or vacation plans. They had collectively decided to withdraw their presence from my life, and the absence felt both devastating and liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, I waited for the anger to cool, for one of them to reach out with a tentative phone call or text message testing the waters for reconciliation. I imagined Sarah calling to discuss the weather, or Michael sending a photo of something that reminded him of me. I found myself checking my phone more frequently than usual, listening for the landline's ring, watching for cars that might slow down in front of my house. But as days turned into weeks, I began to understand that this wasn't temporary cooling-off period. This was a deliberate punishment designed to make me reconsider my decision. They were waiting for me to crack under the pressure of isolation, to call them crying and apologizing, to promise that I would reverse my charitable plans in exchange for restoration to their good graces. The strategy might have worked if my days had been empty of purpose or meaning, but the gift card program had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of agency and impact that existed independently of my children's approval. While they were withholding their love to manipulate my financial decisions, I was discovering that I had built a life that could sustain itself without their validation. I threw myself into expanding the program with an energy that surprised me. Working with attorney Rebecca Martinez, I established the Dollar Store Angel Foundation as a formal nonprofit organization. The legal work was more complex than I had anticipated, requiring detailed documentation of our mission, governance structure, and operational procedures. But Rebecca was patient and enthusiastic about the project's innovative approach to charitable giving. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she explained during one of our planning sessions in her modest office. "Most foundations focus on big-picture issues: education, healthcare, housing. You're addressing the gaps that fall between traditional programs. It's brilliant in its simplicity." The foundation's structure was deliberately streamlined to minimize administrative overhead and maximize direct assistance. We established partnerships with 12 community organizations across Kern County, each one authorized to distribute gift cards to families they identified as needing help with basic necessities. The selection criteria were intentionally broad: working families struggling to make ends meet, individuals transitioning between jobs or housing situations, anyone facing temporary financial stress that affected their ability to afford everyday essentials. As word of the program spread, requests for partnerships came from unexpected sources. The elementary school where Emma attended kindergarten 20 years earlier wanted cards to help families afford school supplies. The community college where Carmen Jimenez was studying requested assistance for students who couldn't afford textbooks and basic materials. Even the hospital where I had worked as a bookkeeper inquired about providing cards to patients facing financial hardship during medical treatment. Each new partnership required careful vetting and documentation, but the work energized me in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I was no longer just managing my own small existence. I was building something that would outlast me and continue helping people long after I was gone. The foundation represented purpose and legacy in ways that simply leaving money to my children never could have achieved. The impact stories began arriving within weeks of the formal launch. A single father used his card to buy cleaning supplies for his new apartment after escaping an abusive relationship. A grandmother raising her 3 grandchildren purchased school clothes that allowed the kids to start the year without the shame of obviously secondhand or ill-fitting garments. A veteran transitioning out of homelessness bought personal care items that helped him maintain the hygiene necessary for job interviews. Each story reinforced my conviction that this money was being used exactly as it should be. These weren't people looking for handouts or easy solutions. They were individuals and families working hard to improve their circumstances, who just needed small amounts of assistance to maintain their dignity and momentum. The gift cards provided that help without bureaucracy, judgment, or complicated application processes. Meanwhile, the silence from my family continued and deepened. I learned about family events through social media posts I happened to see, catching glimpses of birthday parties and weekend gatherings that proceeded without my presence or knowledge. Tyler graduated from high school in a ceremony I wasn't invited to attend. Emma started her junior year of high school without the card and small gift I had traditionally sent to mark the occasion. The exclusions stung, but it also clarified the conditional nature of their love. They had loved me as long as I fulfilled my expected role. The grateful grandmother who appreciated their occasional attention and saved money to enhance their already comfortable lives. When I stepped outside that role and asserted my own priorities and values, I became someone they could discard without apparent difficulty. In August, I received an unexpected visitor. Pastor Williams from Community Baptist Church knocked on my door on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from his garden, and wearing the gentle expression of someone who had heard rumors and wanted to verify them personally. "Lords," he said after I invited him in for coffee, "I've been hearing some things around town about your family situation. I wanted to check on you and see if there's anything our church community can do to help." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest I had had since my confrontation with Sarah and Michael. Pastor Williams listened without judgment as I explained the events of the past few months, from Emma's Christmas comment through the family meeting and its aftermath. He asked thoughtful questions about my motivations and my feelings, treating my decisions as valid rather than symptoms of age-related confusion or grief-induced poor judgment. "It sounds like you've discovered that doing the right thing and doing the expected thing aren't always the same," he observed toward the end of our visit. "That's a painful lesson at any age, but especially difficult when it involves family." His validation meant more than I had expected. For months, I had been second-guessing my decisions, wondering if I was being stubborn or vindictive or foolish. Pastor Williams's perspective helped me see that I was simply being principled, choosing to align my actions with my values, even when that choice came with significant personal costs. Your children are hurting, he continued gently, not just about the money, though that's part of it. They're confronting the reality that they don't know you as well as they thought they did. Parents aren't supposed to surprise their adult children with major life decisions. They're probably feeling like they've lost control of a narrative they thought they understood. His insight helped me understand their silence not just as punishment but as genuine confusion and grief. They had built their expectations around a version of me that was predictable and manageable, someone whose decisions could be anticipated and whose resources could be counted on. By asserting my independence and redirecting my legacy, I had forced them to confront the reality that I remained a separate person with my own agency and judgment. But understanding their perspective didn't change my resolve. If anything, it reinforced my belief that I had made the right choice. My children needed to learn that love couldn't be conditional on financial inheritance, and that family relationships should be based on genuine connection rather than economic expectation. As summer turned to fall, I established new routines that didn't depend on family contact or approval. I volunteered at the community center where Rosa Martinez coordinated services for immigrant families. I attended foundation board meetings where we reviewed program statistics and planned expansion into neighboring counties. I developed friendships with other volunteers and donors who shared my commitment to practical charity and community support. The silence from my children became less painful and more irrelevant, as I built a life centered around purpose rather than family obligation. I still loved them and missed them, but I no longer felt incomplete without their presence. I had discovered that meaning could be found in service to community, that legacy could be measured in lives touched rather than dollars transferred. The Foundation's first quarterly report showed that we had distributed nearly $40,000 in gift cards to over 800 families. The feedback from partner organizations was overwhelmingly positive, with social workers, teachers, and community leaders reporting measurable improvements in the situations of program recipients. We were making a difference that could be quantified and verified, creating impact that extended far beyond the immediate recipients to their children, their communities, and their futures. As I reviewed these numbers in my quiet kitchen on a gray October morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own choices. Not pride in my children's accomplishments or my late husband's achievements, but satisfaction with decisions I had made independently, based on my own values and judgment. The silence from my family continued, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, room for me to grow into a version of myself that wasn't defined by their expectations or limited by their approval. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely for my own principles, and the freedom was both terrifying and exhilarating. Christmas 2024 arrived with a peculiar sense of completeness, marking exactly 1 year since Emma's careless comment had set everything in motion. I woke on Christmas morning in my small house in Bakersfield, not to the anticipation of family gatherings or gift exchanges, but to the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere across the Central Valley, dozens of families were using Dollar Store Angel Foundation cards to buy presents for their children. The foundation had grown beyond anything I had imagined when I first sketched out the idea on a legal pad at my kitchen table. We had distributed over $150,000 in gift cards to nearly 3,000 families across 5 counties. Partner organizations had expanded from 12 to 37, including schools, churches, community centers, and social service agencies. What had started as my personal response to family disappointment had become a recognized model for innovative charitable giving. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of California winter day that made you grateful for mild weather and abundant sunshine. I made my usual coffee and settled into my chair by the front window, watching the familiar rhythms of my neighborhood. The mailman still came at 9, the woman across the street still walked her small dog, and life continued with the same reliable patterns that had anchored my days for decades. But everything felt different now. The silence from my family had lasted 8 months, long enough to prove that it wasn't a temporary cooling-off period, but a permanent severance. They had made their choice. Family loyalty meant financial loyalty, and my decision to redirect my inheritance constituted an unforgivable betrayal of blood obligations. I had grieved the loss of those relationships, but I had also discovered that I could build a meaningful life without their approval or presence. The phone rang just after 10 o'clock, and for a moment my heart jumped with the old hope that one of my children might be calling to wish me Merry Christmas. But the caller ID showed Rebecca Martinez's number, and I felt both disappointment and relief that it wasn't the reconciliation call I still sometimes imagined receiving. "Lourdes, I hope I'm not disturbing your Christmas morning," Rebecca began, her voice carrying unusual excitement. "But I just got off a conference call with some people from the Ford Foundation, who want to discuss scaling up our program statewide. They're talking about potentially funding a pilot program in 3 additional states based on our model." The news was stunning and overwhelming. The Ford Foundation represented institutional charity at the highest level, organizations that distributed millions of dollars annually to programs that demonstrated measurable impact and replicable success. Their interest in the Dollar Store Angel Foundation suggested that my small-scale experiment had implications far beyond Kern County. "They want to meet with us after New Year's to discuss how we developed the program and whether the model could work in different demographic and geographic contexts," Rebecca continued. "Lourdes, this could mean helping tens of thousands of families instead of just thousands." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and tried to process what this recognition meant. 18 months earlier, I had been a retired bookkeeper whose primary concern was whether my Christmas gifts would be adequately appreciated by my family. Now I was being recognized by national foundations as someone who had developed an innovative approach to charitable giving that could potentially transform how assistance was provided to working families across the country. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt inevitable. Every step of the journey had led logically to the next. Emma's comment had opened my eyes to my family's disconnection from financial reality. My research had revealed gaps in traditional assistance programs. My pilot program had proven the effectiveness of the gift card model, and my decision to formalize the foundation had created the structure necessary for meaningful impact. What I hadn't anticipated was how much personal growth would accompany the professional development. Building the foundation had required me to develop skills I had never used, to engage with communities I had never encountered, to advocate for ideas I had never articulated. I had learned to write grant proposals, conduct board meetings, manage volunteer coordinators, and speak publicly about issues I cared deeply about. The woman who had worried about spending $68 on a leather wallet had become someone who regularly made decisions about distributing thousands of dollars to families in need. The grandmother who had felt peripheral to her own family's life had become a community leader whose opinions were sought and whose judgment was trusted. Around noon, I drove to the Sacred Heart Community Center, where Rosa Martinez was coordinating a Christmas dinner for families who might otherwise spend the holiday alone or unable to afford a traditional celebration. I had volunteered to help serve, finding more satisfaction in ladling mashed potatoes onto paper plates than I had ever found in elaborate family dinners, where my presence felt obligatory rather than valued. The center was decorated with handmade ornaments and children's artwork, creating a festive atmosphere that felt more genuine than the expensive decorations I remembered from Sarah's house. Families arrived throughout the afternoon, single mothers with children dressed in their best clothes, elderly people grateful for company and a hot meal, workers who couldn't afford to take time off during the holiday season. Many of the guests were familiar faces from the Foundation's recipient database. Carmen Jimenez was there with her 2 children, who had both improved dramatically in school since their mother could afford proper supplies and didn't have to choose between notebooks and groceries. Marcus Thompson brought his new girlfriend, a woman he had met at the community college, where he was taking business classes funded by his improved financial stability. "Mrs. Champ," Carmen called out when she saw me behind the serving counter, "I want you to meet my children. Maria, Carlos, this is the lady who started the program that helped us buy your school things." The introductions were awkward, but touching. Neither child fully understood the connection between my foundation and their improved circumstances. But they had been taught to say thank you to people who helped their family. Their gratitude was simple and genuine, unmarked by the complex expectations and disappointments that had characterized my interactions with my own grandchildren. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself surrounded by a different kind of family, people who were connected not by blood, but by shared struggles and mutual support. These were relationships built on genuine need and authentic appreciation, uncomplicated by the financial dynamics that had poisoned my interactions with Sarah and Michael. Pastor Williams stopped by during the dinner service, bringing homemade pies from his wife and staying to help with cleanup. "You look content," he observed as we stacked chairs and collected serving dishes. "More at peace than when I visited you in August." He was right. The ache of family estrangement had gradually been replaced by the satisfaction of purposeful work and meaningful relationships. I missed my children and grandchildren, but I no longer felt incomplete without them. I had discovered that love and legacy could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important family was the one you chose, rather than the one you were born into. As evening approached and the community center emptied, I helped Rosa lock up and load leftover food into cars to be distributed to homebound seniors. The work was simple but essential, the kind of practical charity that addressed immediate needs without complicated applications or eligibility requirements. Driving home through the quiet streets of Bakersfield, I reflected on how much had changed since the previous Christmas. I had lost the family I had spent decades serving and supporting, but I had gained a community that valued my contributions and appreciated my presence. I had given up a traditional inheritance structure, but I had created a legacy that would continue long after I was gone. The Dollar Store Angel Foundation would outlast me by decades, helping families afford basic necessities without the bureaucratic barriers that often prevented working people from accessing assistance. The model we had developed would potentially be replicated across the country, touching thousands of lives and proving that innovative approaches to charity could address real needs more effectively than traditional programs. Most importantly, I had learned that meaning and purpose weren't inherited or assigned. They were chosen. My children had seen my life as a series of obligations to them, responsibilities to be fulfilled and resources to be transferred. But I had discovered that I could define my own value and create my own impact, independent of their expectations or approval. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and wrote in the journal I had started keeping since the foundation launched. "Christmas 2024, I wrote. 1 year since Emma's comment about dollar store gifts. Today I helped serve dinner to 200 families, many of whom were able to buy presents for their children using our gift cards. The Ford Foundation wants to expand our program nationwide. I am 69 years old and just beginning to understand what legacy really means." As I prepared for bed, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of a life winding down, but the completion of a transformation that had taken me from peripheral family member to community leader. From someone who worried about gift adequacy to someone who created systematic solutions for family financial stress. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful, filled with the satisfaction of choices well made and principles honored. I had chosen community over family, impact over inheritance, purpose over tradition. Emma's dismissive comment about dollar store quality had revealed more than just generational differences. It had exposed the fundamental disconnect between my values and my family's priorities. In the end, I had found my own way to honor both my savings and my principles. Every dollar I had accumulated through decades of careful choices was now working to help families who shared my understanding of financial struggle and practical necessity. The money my children had expected to inherit was instead creating opportunities for people who truly needed assistance, distributed through institutions they had once mocked, but I had learned to respect. I fell asleep that night surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and resources well used, knowing that somewhere in the darkness families were sleeping more peacefully because they could afford the basics that made dignity possible. It was the best Christmas gift I had ever given or received. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.